in honor of the Barnard Year of Science, which seeks to celebrate all things STEM at the college. My name is Francine Glick, and I'm an alumna from the class of 1977. As a quick reminder, just some housekeeping here, this online event enables an attendee to participate through a personal device's microphone and/or camera. An attendee may elect not to participate through use of a microphone and/or camera. The election of an attendee to use a microphone and/or camera constitutes a release and waiver of rights in the capture of the attendee's image, likeness, and/or voice for the exclusive use by Barnard College. Okay, now I can say I'm really excited to welcome everyone to this event tonight. It's a wonderful thing that we can have alums join us from all over the country or even all the world. It's beautiful to see all of you online and to anticipate that we're going to have the kind of rich discussion that happens when Barnard graduates come together. It is my pleasure to introduce Jane Gilbert from the Barnard class of 1987 and Miami-Dade County's first Chief Heat Officer, who will moderate the conversation today. Ms. Gilbert is working collaboratively across departments, jurisdictions, and sectors within Miami-Dade to address and mitigate the increasing risks to human health, lives, and livelihoods associated with excessive heat. Prior to joining Mayor Daniela Levine Cava's leadership team, Ms. Gilbert served as the City of Miami's first Chief Resilience Officer, CRO, for 4 years. As CRO, Ms. Gilbert led the Climate and Urban Resilience Strategy development and implementation for the City of Miami, and in partnership with Miami-Dade County and City of Miami Beach for the greater Miami region. Prior to her public sector work, Ms. Gilbert managed the Miami Foundation's civic leadership agenda on sea level rise, Wells Fargo's philanthropy and community affairs in South Florida, and served as the executive director for 3 nonprofits, Dream in Green, Arts Center, South Florida. Ms. Gilbert holds a BA in Environmental Science from Barnard College and an MPA from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Jane, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Francine, and hello, everyone. It is great to be with all of you today, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Cynthia Barnett. Cynthia Barnett is an award-winning environmental journalist who has reported on water and climate change around the world. Her new book, The Sound of the Sea, Seashells and the Fate of the Oceans, is a natural and cultural history of seashells and the animals that make them, revealing what they have to tell us about nature, our changing oceans, and really ourselves. Cynthia is also the author of the water books Mirage, Blue Revolution, and one I'm really looking forward to reading, Rain, A Natural and Cultural History, which was long listed for the National Book Award and a finalist for the 2016 Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. She's written for many publications, including the National Geographic, New York Times, LA Times, Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, Discover Magazine, Salon, Politico, and Orion. Her numerous journalism awards, including a National Sigma Delta Chi Prize for investigative magazine reporting. Cynthia is also an environmental journalist in residence at the University of Florida's College of Journalism and Communications in Gainesville, Florida, where she lives with her husband and 2 teenagers. Thank you for being with us, Cynthia.
Jane and everyone, thank you so much for having me. This is such an honor. And Jane, I also love your background. I see some really beautiful mollusk shells that I suspect I actually wouldn't see in Miami today.
No, definitely you would not see in Miami. This was selected for your benefit and
because
Miami.
of all the beach renourishment going on.
Yes, that is so right.
But thank you. It's so nice to be here and nice to see all the faces on Zoom. I love it when we do these kinds of Zoom discussions as opposed to webinars where you can actually see everyone and have chats and so on. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I look forward to the question period at the end here. I'm going to ask you a few questions, and then we definitely will open it up for questions to the audience. So to kick things off, Cynthia, you know, Barnard alums, many are authors in and of themselves or writers in and of themselves. Can you share with us when you first realized you wanted to be a writer, and what key experiences have influenced your writing career?
Yeah, so this is an easy answer, Jane. I actually wanted to be a writer from the time I knew I wanted to be anything. So as young as I can remember, I wanted to be a writer, and I wrote a lot of poetry. I was one of those kids who was always lying on the carpet writing poetry, and I specifically wanted to be a journalist since 5th grade, when I was named the editor of my Girl Scout troop newspaper. And I just loved everything about that, especially being able to dig into things and write stories. So that was always my dream. And that's a great thing about the work I do now. And then to answer your question about key experiences, a really key thing for me, and kind of what caused my shift. I began as a daily newspaper reporter, and then I shifted to magazines, and I shifted to books only in my 30s. And the thing that changed for me, I went back to college and earned a master's degree in environmental history. I had this real curiosity and sense of wanting to know more about our past with water, and specifically, you know, coming from Florida and trying to figure out why things were the way they were, how it could be, for example, that the same group of people who got rid of all the water a couple hundred years ago then became desperate to find it. So I went back and got a master's in environmental history, and it's really valuable, I think, to understand both our water mistakes and our water triumphs in the kind of work that we both do, including the two huge triumphs of moving wastewater out of cities and then bringing clean water into cities, and also, you know, big successes like the public will that led to the Clean Water Act 50 years ago. I think some of those, you know, big successful ideas and policies are really helpful to look back on now as we struggle with climate policy and so many other things that we're struggling with. And it's nice to remind young people too. As you mentioned, I teach as well, and I find that powerful in the classroom as well, to remind people where we came from. So history was a big part of that shift from daily journalism to books.
Yeah, I mean, it's so evident the expansion of your curiosity and how it led you down so many paths with this book in particular. I was so intrigued to read it, and when Barnard invited me to speak this, you know, I studied environmental science at Barnard, and environmental history was actually one of my favorite classes. But you know, I have a deep, long love for the ocean, and it's in part why I moved to Miami and all marine environments, and read A Gift from the Sea when I was a younger woman, and really appreciated that. And even my mom knew Anne Mora Lindbergh, was friends with her through a book club, and so I was just really curious to read it. But I want to understand what inspired you to write this book, Write the Sound of the Sea. And can you tell us a little more about the process?
Sure. So one thing is that I knew I was going to write next about the ocean. You mentioned my first 3 books were all about freshwater. So 2 were about freshwater and water challenges and solutions. And then the 3rd was a biography of rain. And I wanted to write a book of the ocean as sort of a completion of the hydrological cycle. And that feels really good. I love that I've got these 4 books that complete that cycle. That's and might be a good place to end, I'm not sure. But So I knew I wanted to write about the ocean, but I really wasn't sure what my way in would be. And just to tell you the story quickly, I was visiting a museum in Florida. Those of you who have been to Sanibel Island, this museum was called the Bailey Matthews National Shell Museum. They had invited me to give a talk. I was out to dinner with the director, and I learned this incredible story that they had surveyed visitors to find out how much visitors already knew about seashells. And 90% of the visitors who took this survey, many of them children visiting Florida with their families, did not know that a seashell was made by a living animal.
Oh,
Most people thought they were rocks or stones. And that really, it just got to me. That statistic
yeah.
got to me, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I think I tossed and turned that night thinking about it. And by the time I fell asleep, I knew that I wanted to write this book. And it seemed to me specifically that seashells are just incredible ambassadors for the ocean, and that they might be a way to help people understand what's happening to the sea. So not just the animals inside, but the life out there, and what's happening.
Yeah, yeah, real clarion calls. That is fascinating. And you clearly had to do a massive amount of research to create this book, from the cultural, historical, scientific aspects of your research. I'm really curious, what information surprised you the most, and what were some of the biggest challenges in finding information?
Oh, well, finding information is never the challenge for me. I'm good at digging and research, and love interviewing people. I just love that part of it. I think I love the research a little bit too much.
Well, you
And
did a
so
lot. I mean, it's so
right,
rich.
right. So the problem for me was more organizing the material. And again, I'm thinking of, and it's always easier for a writer to build a book around a person, right? Like, I thought there were many times when I thought about building it around one of the women, for example, Julia Ellen Rogers. I
Mhm.
just didn't have enough to carry the narrative all the way through. And so I made a decision that, I'm if I see the seashells as these ambassadors, as I do, maybe the best way in here is to come up with the dozen most iconic seashells in human history and build the book around those seashells. And that's what I ended up doing.
Loved it.
And that's how I ended up starting with the Nautilus, that has been very, classically important in all kinds of ways. The money cowries, which had served as currency. And it was a hard decision to pick those 12, because there are more than 50,000 marine mollusks in the sea. But I picked the 12 that I thought would just draw people in, the shells that people really love.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me that that would allow me to really write an inclusive story, and even a unifying story, to kind of draw people in. And I like that it can be unifying in that way, even though there are certainly devastating stories in the book, from colonialism to climate change stories. But I'm hoping that people can feel that unity in seashells. So you asked me what surprised me the most. And I think the most surprising story in the book, one I absolutely did not expect, but one I loved, was the story of the early Islamic queens.
Oh, yeah.
So when I wrote the book proposal, I wrote in my proposal, I plan to go all the way to the Maldives, and I plan to go all the way to West Africa. And the reason I'm going to take this crazy trip is that, this was the first global money. It's right there. It's at the roots of capitalism. It's right there
Yeah.
at the roots
And
of
who knew
slavery.
that there were these
Yeah.
powerful women in the
Right. And
cultures?
so and the fascinating thing, Jane, is that none of that came up in my initial research that I needed to do to write the book proposal, which is basically how you get the contract. So the queens didn't come up until I got deeper into the story of the Maldives themselves and the harvesting of money cowries in the Maldives. And it was fascinating to me that these women are in charge in these islands in the 14th century, that they are essentially controlling global currency, like,
Oh,
like
in
they're
a big way.
Switzerland or something. And the devastating part is that they are not in the Maldivian history books. They are not in the National Museum. And that this is another question we could talk about, but especially given your role working on climate change, you probably have this conflict too. I am always conflicted to travel long distances because of my impact on carbon emissions. And so I would interrogate every trip. I actually took far fewer trips than I wanted to take, and I interrogated my travel. And I think it's really important for journalists to travel and to bear witness, and it's really important from an inclusivity standpoint to go places like the Maldives and talk to real people instead of talking to talking heads or getting information from businesses or press releases or engineers, trying to build up islands. It's really important to talk to real people. So that I knew that trip was crucial for those reasons. What I didn't understand was that the trip would also reveal that those queens are not in the National Museum there. And I found that heartbreaking. And you remember I was there with my son, and there were these school children touring the museum that day. And I just thought, wow, there are all these sultans. You can see their thrones and the Korans, and you don't learn anything about the Maldivian queens. And so I was really glad to be able to tell that story. It surprised me, and I'm so glad that I was able to tell it. And I think it's one of my favorites in the book for sure.
That's great. I found the history of Shell oil so fascinating, and that it came from these merchants and that were, Jewish merchants selling shells and curiosities. And
it's incredible.
That was just so fascinating to me. And I loved the focus, really learning about the mollusks themselves, and whether it was the scallops or the giant clam, and the connections to cutting edge research that they're contributing to. It was a real joy to me. So this is Barnard's Year of Science, and a common theme in your book is how the path to discovery is a slow, winding, and collaborative, rather than the linear breakthrough of, say, a lone genius, a very sort of male concept. As in the story of the enslaved people who advised Charles Lyell and the father of modern geology about shell fossils underfoot of American plantations, or the various wives, daughters, and other women who contributed significantly to modern science, just in your book, but I'm sure in many other areas where we don't even know, and as did, indigenous people to the ecosystems where the research was being done. And do you think this lone genius myth still persists? Do you think it's fading? And do you think science has become more inclusive and collaborative? And if so, how has that benefited science?
Yes, so I do think the lone genius myth persists a bit too much, right? And it is, you said it was a male lone genius, and it's definitely a white male lone genius myth. And it is ubiquitous, right? And I think even now, and sometimes it is easier to write a story about one person. And that's true if you're writing a science article for the New York Times, or if you're writing a book, it's kind of easier to pick one person to build a narrative around. So in The Sound of the Sea, I worked very hard to build narratives around women scientists.
Yes.
And the funny thing is, you know, some like backhanded criticism of that, people will say, you know, like it was really hard to do that, or how hard it was to find those people. It's not hard at all. Once you know, if you just start looking under any stone or seashell, you're going to find a women scientist. They're out there doing this work. That was not hard. And so anyone who says it is just, they're just not looking. So I think
Yeah.
one problem is just how easy it was to tell the story that way. And I think modern science too perpetuates it. And I've learned this a little being in the realm of a university, which I've only been in the realm of university for 5 years. But even when there's a grant or something, there's a person called a PI, you know, there's a principal investigator, and everything is built around that person. But it's often other people on the team who are working harder or working collaboratively or doing most of the work. And they end up, if there's a paper published, they end up being secondary authors. And then when the journalist or whoever calls to write a story about the paper, they call the PI, and that's the person who ends up being quoted. So something we journalists try very hard to do, and that I teach in my classes, is to, you know, work to find out who did this actual part of the study that you're writing about. You know, to find women scientists. There are so many out there, and so many projects, like 500 women scientists, that are databases where you can find people either as a collaborator or as a writer. So I think the other question you asked was about whether it's changing. I do think it's changing. And I think, you know, it seems to be common knowledge that the best science is collaborative. The Nobel Prizes are announced, and they're often to groups of people rather than one person. So I do think it's changing, and it has benefited science enormously because it makes science inclusive. So you've got, you know, whether it's the gender of the team or the ethnicity of the team or whatever it is, the more people you include, the more inclusive the science. So I do think it's changing slowly, and I think there's a lot more awareness now than ever before. So
yeah, no, and I think there's a real desire in academia to move in that direction, but they are still stuck sort of in this in the frame of needing to publish in your specific field and with the PIs, et cetera, that it's harder. And I see our local universities, who we collaborate with a lot, of both University of Miami and Florida International University and University of Florida, and that building collaborations across the departments within the universities is one challenge, and then between the universities is another challenge. But there's a real desire on everybody's part,
yes,
to try to get there. It's just some of the systems it doesn't currently reward.
Yes, that's a really good point, Jane. And I would say the other trend that's happening is the acknowledgement that of this need to bring together the humanities and the sciences, that this is really crucial. And so this is one of the reasons that it's so great the college is devoting itself to this year of science. It's really a way to bring together the humanities and sciences, because we are going to have to, we're facing these huge complex problems, and we have to solve them in these multidisciplinary ways that look at things in a larger frame. And that is happening too. But that too is hard, because people are used to doing things the way they've always done it. Sometimes it's hard to get a student to work on something completely different, because they're so, you know, they've been told that they must have these credits in this discipline in order to graduate. But I think it's finally changing.
Yeah. You know, it's funny as you say that. In my role, I have to bring departments together and multiple stakeholders together. And
right.
it's really is about, you know, and we have to do it as a society, right? We have to make some big shifts here to heal our planet and our relationships
Yes.
with each other. And it's really interesting to try to get people out of their comfort zone a little bit.
It really
Try
is.
something
It
new.
really is. And it's so important. But it's so, like you said, I mean, what happened with this book, because there was so much history in it, every time I track down some of the men of malacology,
Yes,
there was always, you know, someone's wife who really, whose name should have been on the book, or
right, or the daughters that
someone's
were,
daughter who did the illustrations. And
yeah,
yeah, and in the case of the daughters, the Lister sisters, the beautiful thing about Martin Lister, who's working in the late 17th century, he draws in his daughters, he trains his daughters, he has full faith in his
yes,
daughters
that was
to
nice.
do these illustrations, and their name is on the illustration. So that I love the story of Martin Lister. And there are men throughout history who are really promoting the people who are doing the actual work and making sure they get credit and making sure they get named. But more often, there were men like Charles Lyell, who is, you know, his wife is doing the taxonomy.
Right.
Mary Annan is giving him all kinds of information to aid his science, and those women are never credited.
Yeah, yeah. So in the final chapter, you bring up your son's generation and probably what you see with students at University of Florida, how there seems to be a growing commitment to social justice and climate change. What are some of the ways you think the science community can broaden and engage with these new audiences?
That's a really good question. And I suspect other women on this call who are in my same age group, who might have kids starting college, see this as well. Or teenagers, right?
That would be me too.
Yeah, yeah. There's a great rise of social justice. I know a young woman now in Gainesville, the baddest ass climate justice person in Gainesville is applying to your college, and she's so excited. I wish I could tell you her name, but I won't. I feel sure she's going to get in, and you'll get to know her all yourselves. But it's just wonderful to see these young people. And to answer your question about how to reach them, one thing I think we don't talk about enough in terms of the sensitivity to being inclusive, it's not just being inclusive of women and girls and minorities and all different kinds of people, but it's also being good listeners. So to actually spend time listening to these young people and hearing their ideas, their needs, their ideas for solutions, I find that it's as important to listen to them as it is to talk with them about science, right? So they often already know what we know anyway, and their ideas are very interesting. So also when we think about audience, and I say this as someone who thinks a lot about my audience, there's this fallacy of the general audience out there, that there's this general public that we need to reach and communicate with. And I think, like you're saying, you want to find the audiences are very fragmented now. So you need to find who your audience is and then really connect with that audience. So it might be young social justice people. It might be social justice elders, of whom there are also quite a lot. It could be rural people. It could be audiences of faith. One thing I have found myself doing for several years now is speaking in churches. And that was always, when I first would be asked to speak with churches, I was always quite intimidated because I didn't feel that I belonged. I thought I might be struck by lightning going up and being in front of the pulpit, right? But it's a great place to talk about science and environmental issues. Churches are really interested in welcoming. So I think the idea is to really know your audience and then listen to your audience and what they need. And the single most important thing, and this comes up in the research, and it just makes a lot of sense, is that the most important issue is trust. So I recently heard it put that trust is a gift that must be earned and maintained. And that's true if you're talking about, again, any rural audiences, any particular audience you're trying to build a relationship with is all about trust. And I'm sure, Jane, you must know that so well.
Yeah.
From working on heat issues in Florida.
Yeah.
It must be tough. And I know you've probably learned that lesson 100 times over.
Yeah, I know when I first started as Chief Resilience Officer for the city, it did take some time when we were doing outreach, particularly in low income, historically discriminated against communities. And really, climate change isn't on their radar. They're trying to figure out how to get food on the table, make sure their kids get in schools and keep a job, and trying to realize how you relate climate stress, climate issues to those stresses and that they're facing, and listen. I mean, to your point, it's really about listening and finding the doorway. What's the doorway in to a path.
Right. And that's a really good point. And I think another fallacy, I talked about the fallacy of the general audience. There's also a fallacy of the one right way to communicate. There is really not one right way. There's an argument in my community of environmental writers between people who think you've got to be sounding the emergency now. We're in an emergency. You have to be sounding the emergency every moment now, or, don't hit people over the head with gloom and doom or you'll lose them. Neither of those is a pure, truth for every single audience. Some audiences, like those young social justice people we talked about, they are totally open to hearing about the emergency. They want it. They are going to run with it. It's okay to talk to them on that level. It's not okay for all audiences. And my audiences particularly, I sometimes think of my audience of a group, I think of them as the caring middle, like people who don't know as much as we know about climate change. In other words, they're not on climate Twitter, right? They might have a beach house in Naples. They might love seashells, but they might not really know what's happening to the ocean. And there are lots of people out there like that. I think we make a lot of assumptions about how much people know.
I catch myself all the time. And learning how to communicate that balance between sounding the alarm and focusing on solutions and hope, and where we can go is definitely something you have to feel your way through. I do think that we have to talk about what's at stake, what we are already losing and what we stand to lose. But then really spend the majority of the time on how do we get ourselves out of this. I want to get back to the book for 1 second, then we're going to open up for questions. So the whole relationship with shells, between sometimes being a commodity bought and sold and even serving as money, but some of the leaders talking about it as a gift, and you can't. It's not. And both some of the writers, but also the cultures, and I'm curious. To me, it's almost a metaphor for how our relationship to the natural world has shifted over time, and
it is,
and what we may need to call back a little. I don't know if you.
Absolutely. I'm glad you picked up on that, Jane. I mean, that was a very intentional metaphor by the time I got to the end. So you earlier mentioned Anne Morrow Lindbergh, and I
Yeah.
was certainly inspired by her. My grandmother had gift from the sea around her house. My mom
Yeah.
had gift from the sea around her
Right.
house. I read it numerous times when I was young, and I read it numerous times now for over
Yeah.
the 6 years I worked on this book. And she viewed seashells as a gift, like something to find and give to someone you love. She really
Yeah.
didn't like it when people in Sanibel were, digging up seashells and selling them
Turning
by
it
the
into a market.
basketful. And then there
Yeah.
was this great 17th century naturalist named Rumphius, who also saw them as
Right.
a gift. He was deeply superstitious, and he thought if you bought and sold shells that you would have bad luck befall you. And I thought that was sort of a beautiful metaphor for where we are. And in the book, when shells are used as currency, a lot of dark stuff is going on, right? Slavery being the worst story in the book. And so
Yeah.
I think what it gets to is, nature is nature a commodity? We often call it a resource. I've sort of quit using the word natural resources, because it really it just turns it into a commodity. So as you're saying, what is in the public trust? What can we see as a gift? Is it that shoreline, parts of which we will have to retreat from? And then there's a lot of interesting work, as you know, going on in the Netherlands too, about taking certain areas of farmland and kind of giving it back to the sea, so that water has a place to go and keeps people safe from floods. So I do think there needs to be a profound shift in how we think about nature. As we could think about it as a gift, as a place that can keep us safe if we put it to that use instead of constantly commodifying it.
Yeah. Wow. So now I'd like to take some time for the women in the audience to ask some questions. Please feel free. You can submit your questions either through the chat or unmute your microphone and just ask it. If we start to get multiple people speaking at once, just use the raise your hand function, which is
also Bonnie Claus, who has put something in the chat about Caitlin Carrico. Bonnie, is that the Hungarian woman who we read so much about? Is Bonnie still on?
Yes.
Yes, I loved her story. It was incredible. And that story that she was paid so low too. Remember, there was a terrific story about her in the New York Times about,
That's right.
she was paid low, if I'm remembering it. The scientists who she was working with for a while just let her go, and luckily this other person brought her on, and she so believed in what she was doing that she just kept working on it and working on it and working on it. And thank goodness this one person gave her a place in his lab, and she ends up being the single most important researcher behind the mRNA technology that led to the COVID vaccines. Just an incredible story. And like you, I wish she was better known and got more attention by now, but you've told me about this award I didn't know anything about.
Yeah,
so that's
I think
great
it was
to see.
just maybe last week it was announced, and I was so happy to see it.
Yes.
That's great. Does anyone have any questions? Don't feel shy. Don't be shy, or comments they want to.
Well, since we're having a moment of silence, I just want to thank you so much, Cynthia, because this book is so beautiful and I've really enjoyed reading it. I'm still in the middle of it though. And I'm reading it to my husband and my daughter, and it's interesting. It's so fascinating to me. I've always loved shells. I've always picked up shells, and I have shells around my house. And this kind of made me feel connected to, to mankind, throughout history.
Oh,
I think
I love that comment, Mia. Thank you so much. And I'm so glad you said that. I don't know if you can see behind me, but I have so many like little shell stashes throughout my house. They've kind of consolidated in my office since I was working on the book, but I always had little shell stashes, like those stashes I wrote about in the introduction, where if my daughter, when she was a kindergartner, collected a little handful of shells, I can't bear to give those away as a mother. So I have I have all these little stashes around, and I'm glad that made you feel good and happy, because I was a little worried by the end when I'm talking about some of the unsustainable collecting that goes on in the Coral Triangle around Indonesia. I was hoping people wouldn't feel badly about the seashells they have, because I think it's really important to pick up a few seashells as long as they were empty, and to share seashells with children. You know, the difficult part, the negative thing that happens is when these very low paid fishers collect live shells from the Coral Triangle, and then they end up getting shipped all the way to California or Florida, and you end up buying them in a seashell shop. But certainly these wonderful shells we've collected over our lifetimes with children I think they're important to us in all kinds of ways. You might have seen I've had a lightning whelk at the top of my Christmas tree for many years. And I love the way you put it. It is a way to connect with our early humanity. And that's exactly why I started the book with a Neanderthal, because when I read that study, and that was kind of a wonky scientific study about Neanderthals having collected shells, clearly not for food, I took that and I kind of turned it around and imagined a young girl. And that is my way of blending the humanities and science to try to put together that human feeling that we need to solve our problems with the science that we also need.
Yeah, that's so right. So we have a couple questions coming in the chat. Nancy Schnog asked could you talk a little more about the shell thesis and other thoughts they raised for you?
The shell thesis, I'm trying to, I can't really think of a single, thesis in the book, but it could be, Nancy, are you asking about the impact of climate change on shells?
Hi.
Hi.
Sorry, my video is messed up, so sorry about
Oh,
that.
that's okay.
No, I was just I haven't read the book, so I'm just was curious a little bit more about the content. And, you spoke about sort of the role of shells as a commodity and, early times, but I'm just curious what other thoughts your research and writing raised for you, just maybe a little more how the arc of the book develops.
Sure. So what I get to by the end, which to me becomes very important, is that seashells are beginning to be impacted by climate change. So both the acidification of the ocean. So to step back to the beginning of the book, marine mollusks build shells from minerals in the surrounding seawater, this process called biomineralization. And so the carbon dioxide we send into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels has turned the seawater about 30% more acidic than it was at the beginning of the industrial era. And this has caused a chemical change in the ocean it has begun to limit the carbonate that mollusks use to build their shell. So and then the other issue is, so for one, yeah, for one, acidic waters are harming the shells or harming their ability to build shells. The other issue is warming. Some parts of the ocean have already become too warm for mollusks. So what I do in this book is that I'm telling this epic, beautiful story of humanity and seashells, in some cases epic and beautiful, in some cases dark and frightening.
Right.
But where it is getting to by the end is the fact that we are warming this world to our peril and to the peril of the species with whom we share the planet. And all of those earlier stories, from the rise of capitalism to the rise of climate emissions to the founding of Shell Oil as a tiny little seashell shop in the East End of London, all of that leads us to climate change in this moment where we are. And my hope is that the inspirational people in the book, the many scientists, the many educators and writers who cared so deeply and worked so hard to fix this world. I'm hoping that readers are inspired by some of those characters. So I'm hoping that there's enough balance between the frightening story of climate change and the other perils to the sea, and the inspiration of what we can do, what we have done in the past, and what we can do. That was kind of a rangy answer.
Great
Yeah,
answer.
and there was
Thank you.
also, like, I saw a lot of waves of over harvesting.
Yep.
And the
Yep.
greed, and that it's
Yeah, greed.
climate-
So
Yeah.
right, Jane. And that's a really good point. We are totally focused on climate change a lot of the times when there are all these intersectional
Right.
issues underway, right? There is poverty, there is an over harvesting in many parts of the world is very tied up in poverty. That may not be true here in the United States, but that is certainly true in Indonesia and surrounding areas, and Puerto Rico, where I've been writing recently about Queen Conch. So these issues are intersectional, and that's really important to remember. And that is why I have woven all of it together, and not, I didn't want to write a story just about climate change, because it
Yeah.
is about so much more than climate change.
It's really about our overall human footprint and
Yes.
impact. And that's what's causing urban heat, actually. It's not just climate change, it's urban development patterns.
Right.
And the quality, the destruction of our Biscayne Bay is also so many different things. Climate change is one of them. Rena Krautworth has another question related to that. She was concerned about the line about the microplastics from our yoga pants ending up in the ocean. Is there any way we could be more alert about the products that we buy that might have plastic, even though they seem not to?
Rena, this is a great question, and I'm going to twist it around a little bit, because I think it's often unfair to dump these things on consumers' heads. Like, Rena, I don't want you to feel guilty about your yoga pants when there is a ginormous fossil fuel corporation building a brand new plastics plant, which, if you've gotten to that chapter in the book, you know the plant. The important thing we face is how to change systems. We've got to change systems. And Jane, comes up so often in Jane's work, that we've got to reduce the fossil fuels we send into the atmosphere. We've got to reduce our over-reliance on plastics. And what's happening, and this is the interesting thing about that Shell Oil history, the man who founded Shell Oil, the fuel company, Marcus Samuel Jr., had a really interesting thing that he used to talk about. He would say, the most interesting thing about selling oil is not the oil, it's creating the market. My work is to create the market. And so fossil fuel companies have created a market for their fossil fuels. And now that they're having to transition, they will have to transition away from fossil fuels. They are creating markets for plastics. And so there's there is a shift underway to build more plastic plants all over the world. The products that they make are dangerous to many creatures, not only marine mollusks, but all kinds of other species. And moreover, these plants are contributing really major carbon emissions to the atmosphere. So the systems, the problem is not your individual yoga pants. The problem is the system that is halting action to reduce fossil fuels, that is halting kind of, action on stopping plastic use in general. There are a lot of really great efforts all over the world to reduce plastic use, and invariably the plastics manufacturers come in and, quash efforts to reduce plastic. So those systematic places are the places where I think we need to put our energy. And yes, the way we live makes a collective difference, no doubt, but it is the systems that we have to change.
Yeah, and I'm a big believer in human ingenuity and the creation of new markets, but if we don't have a government intervention to make sure that these externalities of pollution and overconsumption aren't taken care of and addressed. That's really what our democracy is supposed to be doing, is
that's exactly right.
Taking care of these externalities through regulations, through fees, through some sort of policies in order to shift. There's some great examples of companies who've moved from a disposal-oriented company. There was this documentary that came out on this carpet manufacturer Interface. They completely changed their whole system to a circular economy. But we need to make it so that the financial incentives are in their favor.
Yes, that's right.
Solar is is the financial incentives.
Yes, that's the frustrating thing, is that the solutions are out there.
They're absolutely
yes. And you mentioned the circular economy, and I will say that's another thing I love about a seashell and this, this sort of spiral. To me, this is the metaphor for the circular economy too. This is the this is the ultimate recycler of, upcycler. The mollusk is the ultimate upcycler. It is taking all of these minerals from the surrounding sea, turning it into beauty and life. And that can happen. This can happen on a global scale. And it's going to take our ingenuity, like you said, to make this happen.
Yeah. Do we have any last questions? You have Cynthia here, full of knowledge.
I just want to say that I absolutely love the book. And like Mia, I haven't finished it yet, not for any reason other than it's so intense and so absolutely packed with stories. And it's an amazing book. And I love to do research, and I love to read footnotes, and your footnotes are terrific.
Oh, Bonnie, thank you.
They send me off into looking up other things. And so I just think it's really marvelous. And my favorite part was about the cowries and the symbolism that they have for so many cultures, especially of the female anatomy. And I am expecting my 8th great-grandchild, and this will be my first biological female great-grandchild. And so I'm sending my granddaughter my wonderful big tiger cowrie that I picked up on a reef in Hawaii many years ago. And to me, that's sort of symbolizes what I feel your book is about.
Oh, I love it.
our connections with the earth,
Yes.
with nature, with other cultures, with each other over time. I just love it. So thank you.
I'm so moved by what you've said, Bonnie. And as you know, the Japanese had called the cowrie the easy birth shell. So I hope
Yes.
I hope it brings her an easy birth.
Yes.
And it is such a feminine shell for sure. That's something I also love about the cowrie. So thank you for those kind words. I really am honored that you all read the book in your book club, and particularly because it is an intense book. And so I really appreciate that you care deeply and want to read something deeply.
Well, thank you so much, Jane and Cynthia. This was a fascinating conversation, and thank you everyone else for coming tonight. Before we go, I just want to remind everyone who's maybe forgotten that we're in the midst of the Barnard Year of Science, a year-long celebration of all things STEM at the college. Through our world-class research programs and robust curriculum, Barnard is creating a new generation of women leaders in STEM. From neuroscience to psychology to the intersection of science and the arts and beyond, Barnard's leading faculty, brilliant students, and trailblazing alumni are shaping the field and addressing the most pressing challenges of our time through cutting-edge research and practice. During the Barnard Year of Science, the entire college community is coming together to showcase this incredible work, and we hope you will continue to be part of it. To learn more about Barnard's eminence in science, what our faculty, students, and alumni are working on, and to get details about coming events, please visit yearofscience.barnard.edu/. In fact, this coming March, we will be hosting another event featuring Cynthia, and hope to see you there. As a friendly reminder, tomorrow, Wednesday, October 20th, is Giving Day. Barnard will go head-to-head against Columbia University's other schools and programs to compete for challenge funds during Giving Day, the annual 24-hour fundraising event. Last year, our community showed up en masse, held our own against Columbia's fundraising powerhouse schools, and made Giving Day record-breaking for Barnard. This year, we can reach even higher. Find more information at barnard.edu/giving-day. So everyone, please remember to take care of yourselves and each other. And thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.